the very fact of being involved in youth work as a process is more important for the life trajectories of the young people involved than the theme of the youth work being conducted, right? So what does that say then, taking into account what we've just seen? What does that say about those activities where hands-on learning through participation in decision-making is supposed to be a priority, but which are not necessarily delivering that to the extent that was intended? And we talked about those results already. And what kind of processes deliver good results in relation to civic competence, and why are some project types better at that than others? Certainly something which I think an area which would deserve a lot more qualitative research. So we looked a little bit at youth participants, and now what about the project leaders? We have one slide for them. For project leaders, having a hybrid function in a project, an educational and organizational function together, now facilitates the acquisition of a broader scope of competencies than having a simple function, educational or managerial exclusively. So Ray shows that the majority of project leaders have had both an organizational and an educational role in the project. And it suggests, the transnational study suggests that the relatively important organizational and administrative demands on project leaders may be having negative impacts on educational quality, okay? But at the same time, the Special Learning Survey shows that this hybrid function, in other words, being involved in both educational and organizational tasks, is important for the learning and competence development of project leaders. It suggests that those with hybrid functions are exposed to and learn through hands-on experiences in a wider range of activities and work formats than those with exclusively administrative and managerial or educational functions, and that some project types, specifically youth initiatives, youth democracy projects, and youth exchanges, favor this kind of hybrid function more than others, EVS, structured dialogue, and training and networking projects. So, that's all very well, that's fine. But I think what's really significant about that result is that it appears that those with, and that's another result, that those with primarily educational functions have relatively few opportunities to be involved in designing the project and or cooperating with colleagues from partner organizations from other countries. In view of what we just said, the scope and range of their potential learning and competence acquisition opportunities may not be optimal, but we obviously don't have enough data about that, and we definitely would require more qualitative understanding of their experience to be able to say something more conclusive. But it's an area which opens up questions, right? So only having an educational function may be limiting your scope of learning as a project leader, right? And yet there are questions around the level of administrative and managerial pressure, as it were, on project leaders, and how that then affects the educational process. The pedagogical mix of approaches, methods, and settings is important for lifelong learning, LLL, competence development in youth in action, with non-formal education and or informal learning perceived by most young people and project leaders as alike as most important for their learning. Okay? So within the research on learning in youth in action, we know we have quite a lot of information about how project leaders and young people learn best. Okay? So for participants, the findings are, or reveal, that non-formal education methods and situations play the most dominant role. In other words, that those are most effective for their learning in their own self-perception. Now, the mode value for learning best on all skills except one. No? And that informal learning situations show the second highest value. So, no? And this, what's noteworthy for me there is that this kind of situation, non-formal education / informal learning, strongly correlates with best learning in relation to citizenship skills. Links back to what we talked about before. So basically, the combination of NFE and IL, non-formal education and informal learning, seems to be producing the best learning in youth in action. Yet especially informal learning situations are not reported as frequently as the others, non-formal education and informal and formal education. No? So the question this raises is really about the way in which those doing youth in action projects understand NFE and IL, and how they weigh these in relation to each other in the educational concept of a project. No? If they think about it explicitly at all. No? So I think extrapolating, but what it got me to thinking about was how the youth in action, how the community of practice involved in non-formal education, of which youth in action people are part, think about these things. And I think we are very used to the fact that, we've accepted the fact that we have to plan non-formal education if we want to get any learning outcomes. But maybe we're not always so clear about the fact that we can enable informal learning as well with a certain kind of planning. The assumed wisdom tends to be that informal learning is meant just to happen, and will just happen in the non-program time. In terms of practice implications, I wonder if there's mileage in thinking about how to enable informal learning more deliberately in YIA projects. What would that mean for how projects are planned in educational but also in organizational terms? And what does it mean for the methods and activities being employed? And I think just generally, apart from Ray and the research options that kind of question opens, there's also plenty of space for exchange of good practice between different practitioners there, maybe also with experiences from outside the program. That's the one on pedagogical mix. So this one, which I already know is going to be somewhat controversial. In youth in action, effective learning seems to be stronger than cognitive learning. Yet it seems to be the combination of the two that produces the better outcomes for several objectives. So, specifically, in the 2011 transnational analysis, learning effects for affective dimensions of civic competence are stronger than those for cognitive dimensions. It's just one area, right? But we can infer similar results, we can infer a similar conclusion, as it were, from the results pertaining to attitudes and values and how participants learn best in the Ray Special Learning Survey. So my gut feeling about this, and again, extrapolating, it's an interpretation by all means, is that there's been a bit of a mix-up in the community of practice and in the way people perceive things. Cognitive learning is getting a bad name because it's mixed up with formal education. Understandably, practitioners want to safeguard the non-formal and informal character of their projects and of youth in action. But doing so is not mutually exclusive with promoting cognitive learning. It doesn't mean you have to use formal education methods or to be more didactic. You can perfectly well take a learner-centered approach and use non-formal learning methods to learn about ideas and concepts and processes in society and politics and how they relate to each other. In fact, there's reason to believe from other research in the area of citizenship education and political intercultural education that doing this has deeper impact over the life course in terms of behavioral trajectories for civic engagement. So for me, this raises two important questions, which are relevant for both the practice of education in the program and for the more political question of what the program is for. And I know that wasn't my brief, but these things happen to spring up as we go along. So the first question, I think, for the sake of argument, I'm just going to put them out there, right? I think the first question is, what does this mean for the citizenship education function of the program? We know from other research that knowledge about current affairs and political literacy are necessary to develop young people's civic agency. Take a contemporary issue, so-called illegal immigration to the EU. If you don't know anything about the history of European colonialism and the role it has played in the contemporary situation of the countries in development in the Mediterranean and in Africa, it is necessarily more difficult for you to empathize with the migrants fleeing poverty and conflict, and coming to Europe to find a better life, right? You may, in the context of Youth in Action, develop solidarity with a minority in your country that is discriminated against because of racism, but you may not be able to make the link between your sense of civic responsibility in that relation and the plight of the migrants dying in the Mediterranean. And you may not be able to understand what it has to do with your sense of European citizenship. Yet the capacity to do this kind of political reading is important for learning how to act as a citizen throughout the life course. And a program like Youth in Action has something to do there and has something to say there. And then the second question I think that this raises is, what does this mean for the new program, whose outcome orientation focuses quite extensively on employability and on contributing to inclusion, very important objective, but through education, training, and mobility. It's often put out there that soft skills, including a strong sense of one's own values and principles, the capacity to reflect critically on yourself and on your own environment, makes young people more attractive on the labor market. Yeah, and it's certainly true in some respects. But I'm not sure we can take it as quite as at face value as it's put out there often, right, and all of the time. A lot depends on the labor market you're looking at. Yeah, at the European Youth Work Convention, again, Howard Williamson spoke about this really convincingly, at least to me. You know, if you're 18 and a gifted and creative techie, yeah, looking to develop your tech career, yes, I think soft skills gained through volunteering and civic engagement might indeed make you stand out from the crowd of young, talented programmers all looking to do the same thing, and to get a great job. That might indeed make you more competitive, because in the context of widespread innovation and creativity, your critical thinking might just hit the mark. But if you live in a former mining community in South Wales or in Sachsen-Anhalt in Germany, where the only available jobs often are in call centers and in logistics centers, then prospective employers are not looking for critical thinkers, right? They're looking for obedient worker bees, right, with a smile, who don't ask questions and who get on with their work with a smile and a nod, and preferably for the lowest wages possible. These are two very, very different labor markets, and they demand very different sets of skills, including different sets of soft skills. And they're not the only labor markets. There are even more of them. So I think, if anything, the thing that I'm trying to get at here is that there might be something of a mismatch between the expectations placed on Youth in Action as a program and what it can actually deliver through its specific project types. But this is definitely something that we would need more qualitative and comparative research about. And we would also need to take into account other experiences and other research to understand it better. So that brings me to the end of the section on learning. And how do these things play out in your experience of learning in Youth in Action would be my question for the next 10 minutes or so. Yeah. So there are 4. Yeah, there are 4 of these. I'll flick through them as we go along. Okay, we'll start to wind it up now. Two more minutes. Okay, maybe we could get some feedback from the tables if there are comments with regard to how these things play out in your experience of youth in action, things that you'd like to share. Anybody have something they'd like to share? Yes, please.
Well, what we pointed out in here were basically two things. First one is that the Youth in Action program was divided into certain actions and sub-actions, and these obviously had like different purposes and were focused on different things. So it might be better to actually analyze this with respect to these actions, as some of them were really focused on this like civic thingy, whereas others were basically not. And another thing is that this whole notion of civic competence is quite wide compared to the other dimensions we have measured. So it might actually be, and maybe it even is, that lots of the other stuff we have measured is actually like gaining to this, civic competence, even though we have not really included it in the analysis or whatever, because it wasn't the point at the time.
Mm. Sure. Any other feedback from the tables? Okay. You'll be pleased to know that this is the last round of slides. Yeah? And it deals with quality. So there are a lot of definitions of quality in the youth work field, and a lot of ways of assessing it, also within Youth in Action. There's no specific universal standard, but many that are applied voluntarily in the different contexts and by different stakeholders. And this is a really good thing. I mean, it's a good thing that people are thinking about quality and doing something to actually implement and consider quality in their work. But there are some things which are kind of considered to be important across the board and which might serve as a baseline for minimum quality standards. At least that's how I would read the Europe-wide debates on this issue and the related issue of recognition. I also think that the fact that so many competence frameworks have been developed over the last years to address quality and recognition of European youth work and non-formal education, is testimony to that, to the acceptance that some kind of minimum standard of quality should be or is in application in the field. So when discussing these statements about quality, I just want to add another disclaimer to the whole thing, and to say that I'm not making any specific judgments on the basis of any one standard, but rather I considered how the standards are discussed in formulating the statements and in choosing the data, as it were. So, you remember when we talked about learning earlier, there are quite a lot of